Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. Again, welcome to this live stream on Jean-Luc Marion and his radical phenomenology of givenness. It's a great privilege to get to talk about this wonderful philosophy of Jean-Luc Marion. I'll be taking a lot from my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, an etude in phenomenology, forward by Jean-Luc Marion himself. What a great gift it was to get to study with him at the University of Chicago. His generosity in being a part of my dissertation committee and a great mentor to me over the years. So I love to get a chance to talk about his philosophy and 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 simply at arm's reach, I would say. Uh, I want to just think along with Marion in this video, and I have my whiteboard to help do so. Thinking about Jean-Luc Marion and his Phenomenology of Givenness. I think the best book of his to think about this philosophy is his book called Being Given in French, Étant Donné. And in this book, subtitled Toward a Phenomenology of Givenness. It's a tremendous book, a tremendous development of the phenomenological reduction begun with Edmund Husserl, carried through Heidegger, and many other thinkers, Edith Stein, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Max Scheler, so many others in the 20th century. But Marion sees a trajectory running from Husserl through Heidegger to himself, especially as he talks about this in his book, Reduction and Givenness. So I got to take a course with Marion on the concept of givenness, and Husserl, Heidegger, Alexius Meinong as a kind of minor contributor, yet significant in understanding the phenomenon of paradox. And then thinking about Marion's work also through that course. And so I want to talk about his phenomenology of givenness, exercising the phenomenological reduction to such radical degree that we move beyond what we have in Husserl and Heidegger. So Husserl brings us to what we could call eidetic objectivity of the phenomenon. Husserl eidetic objectivity. What Husserl is getting at is we get to the things themselves through their immanent giving in conscious intuition as eidetic in terms of their essential givenness in consciousness. Eidetic from the Greek eidos, we would translate form, but also in the sense of essence of a thing. Again, not so much in a metaphysical sense, asking the question, what is it? But in the sense of how is it giving itself as itself? What is this or that phenomenon in its eidetic essential objectivity? So Husserl gets us to this with his reduction that we could call transcendental reduction that gets from transcendent data to immanent data of consciousness, focusing on the transcendent subjectivity. And this is a Husserl's reduction. Then we have Heidegger, who radicalizes the reduction to the self-showing of being and gets us to, we could say, the self-disclosure of being, sein. Through Sayenden, through phenomena, but awakens us to the horizon of phenomenality, of phenomenal givenness, as a context, as interpretive context of being. So we can talk about Heidegger's reduction as an ontological one, but also an existential one, because it's a self-disclosure of being and Dasein. So for Heidegger, we get an opening to an investigation not only of eidetic objective givenness of phenomena, but a further investigation into the interpreter of the phenomena, the one experiencing the phenomena, and that is what he calls Dasein. Not the person, not the soul, not the mind, not even a human subject, but all of this is implied in this language of Dasein, being there, the one who recognizes the self-showing of being in and through beings. So it's asking the question of being through a new method in philosophy we call phenomenology. So this is the great contribution of Heidegger in the history of Western philosophy, asking the Seinsfrage, the question of being, through the new method of phenomenology. Then we have that Heidegger learned from Husserl. Now we have Marion. How is Marion different than Husserl and Heidegger? In terms of, first of all, his phenomenological reduction, Marion's reduction is one that moves beyond eidetic objectivity, moves beyond the self-disclosure of being and the self-knowledge of Dasein and its most authentic possibilities of living, but he wants to radicalize the reduction to the concept of givenness itself, and that's as simple as that. Marion's donative reduction to givenness itself, he regards as an absolute. So Marion is arguing this is as far as we can go with the phenomenological reduction to givenness, Gegebenheit, Donation. And it's based on the purity of the gift phenomenon. In his book, Being Given, he has a whole section on the phenomenon of the gift. And is it possible that we can experience a phenomenon of the gift? Many philosophers say it's not possible to experience the phenomenon of the gift, but Marion says it is, and we're going to talk about that. Marion says it's possible to experience the gift with no strings attached, without nestling the gift within an economy of exchange, where there's no implied obligation outside of the framework even of justice. So Marion argues we can have a phenomenon of pure gift, and this is a concrete instance of the absolute character of givenness, this phenomenological reduction to givenness alone. So let's think about this together, again taking excerpts from a 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist. So the idea of givenness in Marion is very closely related to the original use of the term in Husserl. For Marion, givenness is a matter of appearance and manifestation for conscious recognition. Yet Marion claims to radicalize the phenomenological reduction even further than Husserl by unbinding givenness from eidetic or ideal objectivity alone. Whereas Husserl regarded givenness as the pathway for ideal objects to present themselves to consciousness, Marion views givenness as the fundamental dynamism of all phenomenal appearing, ideal object or otherwise. Like Husserl, Marion privileges the immanence of the given phenomenon, but instead does not limit immanence to the noetic matrix of the given in consciousness. In effect, Marion expands Husserl's principle of all principles by, in some ways, crossing out the final clause that has to do with givenness in the limits in which it gives itself. So Marion wants to push the envelope of limitation and call it into question. And this clause of Husserl is spelled out further in his negative formulation of the principle that we can find in Husserl's Ideas 1, section 59, where he writes, "The norm that we should follow as phenomenologists, namely, to claim nothing that we cannot render essentially evident to consciousness itself in its pure immanence. To claim, in Anspruch zu nehmen." So Marion objects to Husserl's proposed limits on the possibilities of givenness itself, all the while admitting to the limits of human perception and recognition. So Marion, in his book Being Given, English translation, page 319, writes that givenness often gives the given without measure, but the gifted always keeps within its limits. So acknowledging the final clause of Husserl's principle of all principles, but we hear him further. By excess or by default, givenness must in many ways, many cases, renounce appearing, be restricted to abandon. This is Marionian language. Abandon, abandonment, saturation, in excess, in the flesh. Husserl also has this language of in the flesh. But Marion thinks about the givenness of a phenomenon given up to the point of abandonment through a very saturating experience in which we can describe through phenomenology not just what gives itself and what perception can detect, but also, in a sense, like the photographic negative of the phenomenon. And Marion also has a book called Negative Certainties related to this, that we can also describe the apophatic absence of this, what's happening along the fold of givenness, the given phenomenon, along the Heideggerian horizon of Gegebenheit, givenness itself, across the Umwelt. We can describe all of this that's going on, including an apophatic via negativa description of what we don't see, yet nevertheless gives itself. So Heidegger sets up Marion for this in terms of the perpetual concealedness of Sein, being. In spite of its self-revelation, there's always something on the hind side that we also have to come to terms with. It's similar, not exactly the same, as in astrophysics talking about dark matter. We say there must be some other kind of stuff here, force here, that's acting for all these things to happen that we do detect empirically, but we can't get at the dark matter directly, exactly. We're still investigating what, for natural science and metaphysics, what is this stuff? But for phenomenology, again, the question is not what is, but what gives. So we're describing all that gives itself in perception, but we're also wandering into what else gives precisely in the givenness of absence. Givenness of absence. How does absence give itself? How does lack give itself alongside or behind the given phenomenon that we do see, that does manifest itself? So it's kind of like talking about the dark side of the moon again, the dark side of the phenomenon, that we have to grant legitimacy, that we have to assent to its right not to reveal itself, but to conceal itself, to hide itself. So with Marion's phenomenology, we're getting at the possibilities of hiddenness, not as something that is out of bounds for phenomenological description, but something that we should describe alongside what is being manifest to consciousness. So Marion objects to Husserl's proposed limits on the possibilities of givenness itself, all the while admitting to the limits of human perception and recognition. For Husserl, quote from Marion's Reduction in Givenness, his book, Reduction in Givenness, for Husserl, quote, consciousness therefore determines phenomenality by reducing every phenomenon to the certitude of an actual presence, far from phenomenality requiring that consciousness be itself determined by the conditions and the modes of givenness, which are always multiple and disconcerting. So that's Marion's quote. So this is a key point for Marion, and let's think about this. What he's getting at here. So for Marion, in contrast to Husserl, we want to think about how phenomenology works. So we have, again, the human subject, and we have some phenomenon. We have some givenness of the phenomenon that gives itself to the human subject. And what Marion is saying here is that Husserl is saying that human consciousness is determining limits for this givenness. Through this intentionality. So the intentionality of consciousness that goes out to meet the phenomenon is determining too many limits for its self-manifestation. And this arrow here, we say is givenness through intuition. And again, givenness, this is very linear, but in actuality, givenness is what envelops the human subject, in Heidegger's Umwelt. So Marion acknowledges all these things, but what Marion is calling into question is when intentionality is dominating the givenness, the given phenomenon. When intentionality is dominating it, and Marion is saying, though Husserl allowed us to retrieve the purity of Gegebenheit, the given phenomenon in the flesh, there's still too much intentionality, again, which Husserl learned from Henri Bergson, too much intentionality that is delimiting the givenness and putting it in some kind of predetermined field. But the phenomenological reduction wants to remove the brackets of delimitation by bracketing them and setting them aside. So the phenomenological reduction wants to bracket the brackets and set them aside so that we can have more givenness, giving itself through the lived experience. That's what Marion is doing here in challenging Husserl's limitations to phenomenological giving. So instead, Marion proposes to unfetter givenness from the alleged limits to which consciousness would confine phenomena. That is to say, that for phenomenology, possibility trumps the certitude of actual presence. So what's most decisive for Marion in his phenomenology is not the intentionality of consciousness, but the counter-intentionality of the phenomenon self-giving. This is to say that for phenomenology, The possibility of the new and unprecedented phenomenon needs to be liberated from the constraints of the sum total of past actualized phenomena and patterns of appearance. The future must remain an open horizon of possibility, a future that unfolds according to givenness manifest in the elusive present. So this is, to quote Heidegger, that for phenomenology, possibility stands higher than actuality. Heidegger says this in Sein und Zeit, Being and Time. So it's the elevation of possibility, not through an idealism, not through wishful thinking, but in truth-telling of the very shape of experience. Is it not phenomena that awaken consciousness, that give consciousness something to do, that kiss consciousness out of its unperceptive slumber? The phenomenon kisses consciousness so that it becomes awake through its counterintentionality. So it's not that the self awaits all this giving exactly. It's the self continues to breathe because phenomena give it the oxygen it needs to breathe. Because also it's possible that a phenomenon would pass beyond the limits of consciousness, in which case the phenomenon itself need not be annulled or disqualified. As we say, like the dark side of the phenomenon, that which hides itself all the while giving itself, need not be disqualified for phenomenological perception and description. We also can receive absence. We also can receive the hiddenness of a phenomenon. So, for example, we can receive that which gives invisibility along with that which gives visibility, both at the same time, or the possibility that the invisible, the infinite, might give itself in and through the visible, the finite. So we're getting at a paradoxical phenomenon with Marion. We already have it in Heidegger. We already have it in Heidegger's Sein. That we're going to talk about Sein and the self-manifestation of Sein, all the while talking about its unmanifestation, its hiddenness, its concealedness, its abyss. And Marion wants to talk more about we say the apophatic side of the phenomenon through givenness. So if we're going to talk about the givenness of hiddenness, what is this experience? What is this perception? What is this description then? Because phenomenology is opening philosophical perception to more than meets the eye. More than meets the eye. To use a saying of the Transformers. It is possible that the phenomenon exceeds the limits of consciousness. But we don't, for that reason, need to disqualify the excess, the saturation. We can still deal with it in phenomenology. We may have to come back around to a new fresh perception, to a new angle, to a new description. But this is the very meaning of contemplation. We circle back. We let the givenness give itself again and again. And children are very good at recognizing they're attracted to saturation. You read a child a book that he or she enjoys, and they ask, read it again. Go back to the beginning. This is the phenomenology of givenness. Go back to the beginning. I want to hear it again. I want to ponder it more. We do this, don't we? With a song we like on the playlist, we want to hear it again because it gives more than it gave the last time and the time before that and the time before that. We don't say, I reached the end of the limit of that song's givenness. When it's saturating us with meaning, with feeling. We don't say, I've seen enough sunsets in my lifetime. I don't need to see any more. We're brought again to the bluff, to the beach, to the horizon. And why stuff like the sunset, the mountaintop view, the song, the love within the relationship, the prayer, the live stream, all these different things, why are we brought to them again and again? Because they keep on giving. They give in new ways, to new degrees, with new surprises, and we're not let down. We're not disappointed in this fresh experience of givenness, especially when we're dealing with saturated phenomena. And this is what Marion is drawing our attention to here. And especially paradoxical phenomena. And again, what's the meaning of paradox for Marion when it comes to saturating givenness? That I receive something of the phenomenon, all the while failing to receive what it's giving. I receive, yet I do not receive. That's a paradox. It's the same phenomenon. There's a unity of givenness, but it transgresses the limitations which I bring before it. And Marion wants to describe the phenomenality of the saturated phenomenon. Not just what I receive, but also what I might not be receiving but still giving itself in any case, and gathering up the evidence of the hiddenness. Negative certitudes, negative certainties. That the phenomenon itself, by virtue of its own givenness, by virtue of its own self-manifestation and saturation, is its own justification for appearing and concealing itself. I am not the arbiter. I am not its judge. I am its witness. This is the language Marion uses. I am simply the witness to the phenomenon, especially the saturated phenomenon. So in his book Reduction and Givenness, Marion admits that his critique of Husserl begins with Heidegger's critique of Husserl, and that Marion simply extends the Heideggerian critique of Husserl further. So let's think more about this critique through Heidegger to Marion. Whereas Husserl's phenomenology is based on ideal objectivity, Heidegger moves beyond the supremacy of the Sachsphäre, the sphere of things, in order to ground phenomenality in the lived experience, first as Erlebnis, lived experience in general, but then Erlebnis as Ereignis, the event of appropriation of the givenness of the phenomenon. So a quote from Heidegger's work Towards the Definition of Philosophy. Heidegger says, in immediate observation, I do not find anything like an I, but only an experience, Erleben, of something, a living toward something. So Marion is going to critique Husserl through Heidegger, and beginning with this attentiveness to the horizon of Sein's self-revelation through Seienden, through phenomena. But toward the end of his book, Reduction and Givenness, Marion calls into question Heidegger's critique of Husserl. So we have this paradox within Marion's critique of Husserl, yet critique of Heidegger's critique of Husserl, retrieving something again in Husserl that contributes toward a more radical reduction to Gegebenheit itself, givenness itself. So this is so interesting. And this is what I observed when I was in class with Marion, that on one hand, he's very Heideggerian, but on the other hand, he's very Husserlian still, in spite of Heidegger's critique of Husserl. So again, on one hand, Marion is happy to critique Husserl along with Heidegger. But on the other, Marion sees something more radical in Husserl than in Heidegger. Just like I will argue later on in other presentations and actually in this book, I argue that while Marion critiques Levinas and claims to go farther than Levinas in this radicality of a phenomenology of givenness, I will argue, not in this video, but later, that there's something still more radical in Levinas that we have to retrieve beyond Marion. And so it's like this leapfrogging, yet getting back in line. We play leapfrog and we get back in line and we make progress. This is what we see. A critique of the critique, which pushes us further down the road. So again, Heidegger critiques Husserl for neglecting the Seinsfrage, the perennial question of being that we have in pre-Socratic philosophy through the whole of Western philosophy. And that it thus Husserl contradicts his own principle of returning to the things themselves by neglecting the question of being and taking it seriously within the method of phenomenology. Now, we might recognize that Husserl would be reluctant to use the language of being because he may be afraid of the importation of classical metaphysics within phenomenology. And so he may bracket the language of being. We see it sometimes in Husserl, but it's not prominent. Husserl may bracket the language of being, whereas Heidegger brings it in full force without the suspicion that the Seinsfrage is a Trojan horse that will unleash the troops of classical metaphysics and ruin the phenomenological project. So instead, Heidegger risks asking the question of being through the method of phenomenology. But then Marion comes around and wonders if this critique of Heidegger to Husserl might be reversed. If the being of beings in the end does not offer the ultimate and irrevocable Sache selbst, thing in itself, that Husserl was after, then it remains possible that Heidegger missed the radicality of Husserl's original claim. So here's a quote from Marion's book, Reduction and Givenness. Quote, in other words, Heidegger's slogan against Husserl, that the possibility of phenomenology surpasses its actuality, could be turned back against the undertaking of Sein und Zeit. The ultimate possibility of phenomenology would consist in the question of being no more than it is exhausted in the objectivity of the constituted object. Beyond the one and the other equally, a final possibility could still open to it. Now, this is Marion. That of positing the I as transcendent to reduced objectivity, but also to the being of beings, that of positing itself by virtue of the reduction carried out to its final consequences outside of being. Outside of being, question mark. This is Marion's contribution. This is why I call, and other scholars of Marion have called Marion's phenomenology apophatic. There's a via negativa that we see here that makes it possible within the realm of philosophy, and namely phenomenology, to consider religious experience, to consider the possibilities of divinity and divine revelation. This whole theological turn in French phenomenology of the 20th century now to the 21st century depends, especially, I would say, on Marion's critique of Husserl and Heidegger, radicalizing the phenomenological reduction even more to the purity of givenness, putting no limitations on, without sounding too metaphysical, the origin of the giving, without putting any limitations on what phenomenon are we perceiving and then talking about. Everything is fair game for this phenomenology of givenness developed by Jean-Luc Marion, including phenomena that we might consider outside of being, even in terms of the Heideggerian self-showing of being. What if we let the horizon expand further beyond the constrictions of Sein? So this kind of proposal that Marion is making, classical metaphysics says we've lost reception. We don't know what you're talking about, Marion, outside of being, beyond being. What are we even thinking about anything rational at this point? And Marion is raising the question. Again, for philosophy, every question is fair game. Anything that ends with a question mark, we want to try to follow it where it leads, try to make sense of it. So he's simply asking the question, outside of being, question mark. Is it possible to go beyond Heidegger through Husserl once again? Is there something radical in Husserl that Heidegger glosses over by moving his attention to experience and the phenomenality of experience? What happened to zu den Sachen selbst, to the things themselves? What happened with Husserl if we turn our attention to the horizon of givenness? What happened to the givenness of the phenomenon? So Marion says, Husserl, yes. Heidegger, yes. Yes to all this givenness. And what about a givenness that we maybe have been missing all along? What if we have been falling prey to a reductionism in the name of the phenomenological reduction that is unwarranted in the name of givenness? So for Marion, he wants to bracket the natural attitude even more, because with every phenomenologist, we have a successful bracketing of the natural attitude, but never enough. That's the very ethos of phenomenology. That could be a slogan. Never enough. We haven't gone far enough, not radical enough. We continue to open, we continue to desire the dilation of perception in relation to the phenomena. And to do that, we need to radicalize the reduction even more by bringing about what I ultimately call in this book, the dialectical reduction, the dialectics of the phenomenological reduction, that we need to combine forces through similarity yet dissimilarity. So we need to combine the benefits, the contributions of Husserl and Heidegger together, and then we get this contribution of Levinas, we get this contribution of Ricoeur, we get this contribution of Marion. And now we have a great challenge in the 21st century of knowing something about all of these phenomenologists and combining forces to radicalize the reduction even more, another step further. But Marion, for his part, allows us to cross the threshold of possibility through the phenomenological reduction to the final frontiers of possibility of positing the ego outside of being, outside of Sein. It doesn't automatically result in a world of make-believe and fantasy, but what he's trying to do is take seriously the phenomenological givenness of otherwise than being. And where is he getting this? From Levinas. Directly from Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas, his last great book, Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence. Levinas is already pointing in these directions through ethics as first philosophy. And this is where we have a difference, a great contrast between Marion and Levinas, because Marion wants to try to make contact with a givenness outside of being, a givenness outside of the confines of even objectivity, in terms of the apophaticism of the object, the hindsight, with like the dark side of the moon, the dark side of the object. We already have something illuminated through Heidegger in thinking about the Umwelt and the horizon of self-disclosure of Sein. But Marion wants to think all of this outside of being. And what do we have here? Positing phenomenality beginning not from the ego, because Heidegger's phenomenology is very egocentric. It's very self-centered, yes, and not in a judgmental way, in an opinionated way about his philosophy, but just describing, he's talking about being towards death. Whose death? The ego's death, not the other's death. This is Levinas. Levinas, his phenomenology is very other-centered, very much of a contrast to Heidegger. Though learning much from Heidegger, very much contrast to Heidegger. Heidegger we have the self at the center of things, the self, the protagonist of the project. The self, for all of its merits in attending to the things themselves through Husserl, it's like a boomerang coming back to the self, and the self analyzing everything from its own zero point of orientation. With Marion, he wants to radicalize the self-interpretation of the self vis-a-vis the otherness of givenness. Phenomenal givenness that is outside of subjectivity, that grants subjectivity to subjectivity. So talk about getting back to the things themselves. Marion is trying to do this in the most radical way. So when I was in class with him, I thought, at the end of the day, he sounds more like Husserl than Heidegger, even though we spend all these hours reading Heidegger, him interpreting Heidegger, appreciating Heidegger. But there's something he's retrieving from Husserl that starts to get lost in Heidegger. And so Marion is retrieving something in Husserl, but through Heidegger. But again, with Marion, the big critique, all the critics of Marion, the commentators on Marion, the big critique they have is what happened to hermeneutics in Marion. And hermeneutics takes a back seat to givenness. Whereas in Heidegger, we have much more hermeneutics going on, much more concerned about how the ego interprets given phenomena along the horizon of their self-showing. We have much more attentiveness in Heidegger to Dasein. Marion is moving away from Dasein. Not being there, the being there of subjectivity, recognizing the being there of objects, recognizing the being there of the self-showing of being, and even its hiddenness. But we have in Marion being given. étant donné. And the accent is on the donné, the givenness. And being, not even as a part of Marion's grammar. Marion brackets the language of being out of the project. This is something, yes, very different than Heidegger. And Marion's title of his book, Being Given, toward a Phenomenology of Givenness, he's playing with the term being. Being not as verb, not as noun, but simply as gerund, setting up the accent on givenness. So, indeed, to the things themselves. Going back to Husserl's battle cry, Marion takes up the banner, takes up the standard, the coat of arms, zu den Sachen selbst. And the Sachen selbst, the things themselves, are their givenness. In every form, in every way, what we're going to gather up in phenomenology is givenness. Whether it be ethical, as in Levinas, whether it be ontological and existential in Heidegger, whether it be eidetic and objective as in Husserl. We're going to gather up all the givenness and receive it, mostly in Marion. That's the point, to receive what gives itself as itself, by itself, through its counterintentionality vis-a-vis human subjectivity. And we could even go so far to say, I don't think Marion says this, but talking about the Dasein of the phenomenon, the personification of the phenomenon to such degree that it gives the self to itself. This is Marion's radical phenomenology of givenness, an inversion of intentionality. So Marion, again, follows Levinas on this in Levinas's book, Entre nous. He has an essay that talks about counter-consciousness. And Marion runs with this concept, and he calls it in his book, Being Given, counter-intentionality. So this is definitely what's happening in Marion, responding affirmatively to the question, outside of being? Yes. We're going to investigate. We're going to be pioneers to investigate the phenomenality outside of being. And so he does this even in the realm of theology. He publishes the book, Dieu sans l'être, God without being. This is a revolution. This is a great coup within Western philosophy that we're talking about beyond being. To shed the strictures of being and its question is to open phenomenality to its ultimate possibilities, possibilities already giving themselves. The newness is not in the discovery of brand new phenomena, but in further recognition of what has been giving itself all along, as well as the open possibilities of what may give itself in the future. Marion's transgression beyond the Seinsfrage, beyond the question of being, opens to a further question aiming at the wonder of all wonders and the phenomenon par excellence. Marion wonders what sort of phenomenon could serve as a model of utmost possibility, not a possibility limited in some fashion from the start, from the outset, but a possibility exceeding every imaginable limit, namely the impossible, that nevertheless remains the utmost for possibility. An inverted metric, where you have no metric, with neither beginning nor end. In his book, The Visible and the Revealed, English translation, page 45, Marion writes, quote, thus following the guiding thread of the saturated phenomenon, phenomenology finds its ultimate possibility. How beautifully put. In order to enter the realm of the alleged impossible, we can't just will it. We can't just will our arrival. We can't just will the itinerary. All we can do is follow the guiding thread of the saturated phenomenon. That is contemplation. We could say we follow the breadcrumbs of the saturated phenomenon into this world we thought was impossible. Well, what might be some real life examples of this? The possibilities of forgiveness. Wow. 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 What payoff. The possibilities of forgiveness. We see the language of forgiveness even in this term. Can I forgive her? Can I forgive him? Well, it depends on the gift that was given in advance. The forgiveness. So, talk about it in this book and others. The possibilities of divinity. In terms of exploring the phenomenality of divinity. What might be meant by this? Not, even in terms outside of being, outside of Thomas Aquinas. The possibilities of love. How can I love if I don't feel loved? In his book, The Erotic Phenomenon, Marion goes into these possibilities that I can decide to love because of the power of its possibilities. So we're talking about phenomena that at first we don't have anything given. We have an openness of, is this possible? We have a labyrinth to venture into with Marion's Phenomenology of Givenness. A labyrinth awaits, but we must take the next step according to the guiding thread of the saturated phenomenon, whether it be the event, the idol, the icon, the flesh, divine revelation, the possibilities of forgiveness and reconciliation, the possibilities of rest, the possibilities of peace, the possibilities of surrender, the possibilities of the radical passivity of subjectivity in the face of all that gives itself to the self who has long ago forgotten itself because the saturation has enveloped it and moved it in an ecstatic way toward a widening of possibility. So for Marion, the ultimate possibility would be not only with Heidegger the possibility that exceeds actuality, that exceeds the actualities of metaphysics, classical metaphysics, and ontotheology, but the possibility that surpasses the very conditions of possibility, the possibility of unconditioned possibility. Oh my goodness. Okay. That is crazy. That is unbelievable philosophy. That is a prize won. That is, oh my goodness. So with Heidegger, we have possibility radicalized, but always conditioned by the Seinsfrage. We don't get out of it. Always conditioned by the locus of Dasein. We don't peel away from Dasein. Thank you, Heidegger, for getting us this far, but thank you, Levinas, for taking us further than Dasein toward l'autrui, the other. And then thank you, Marion, with the help of Levinas, to open us to the radicalized concept of possibility that is not just possibility with conditions, conditioned possibility, conditioned by the Seinsfrage, conditioned by the omnipresence of Sein, the almighty ego in Dasein. But with Marion, we have, what about a divestment of the Seinsfrage, of Sein, of Dasein, and deal exclusively, because inclusively, with givenness, Gegebenheit, Donation, and all of a sudden, we have opened up within philosophy, within the realm of thought, the possibility of unconditioned possibility. In other words, the possibility of the alleged impossible. And Marion says, this is not just theoretical possibility, but the possibilities are being delivered through the givenness of saturated phenomena. They show us not only the dilation, the expansion of the horizon of experience, but they dilate the ego through a happy self-forgetfulness of the ego and a contemplation of the phenomenon, especially in the form and figure of the gift. Contemplation of the phenomenality of gift is moving us into these uncharted waters, unexplored territories, saturating territories of saturated phenomena, the possibility of unconditioned possibility. So again, I'm reminded of something Marion said once in class, that he talked about the fact that we attempt to draw a line between possibility and impossibility. We delineate. Here's the possible, here's the impossible. Suggests the possibility that this line can be crossed. The fact that we draw a line between possibility and impossibility suggests the possibility that this line could be crossed, that we can transgress the alleged delimitation of possibility through opening of possibility led by the saturated phenomenon. Thank you for your question, Imran. Could I say more about how this question of what is outside of being is given to us by what gives in saturated phenomena, rather than being inside the locus of the interpreted concerns of Dasein? Yeah, so I mean, that's the first point, is the upending of subjectivity, the upending of Dasein by the power and possibilities of the counterintentionality of the phenomenon that not only gives itself to itself, but makes the self forget itself, that saturates the self to such degree that Dasein is no longer central. Phenomenology is decentralized by the saturated phenomenon. The decentering and dispossession of Dasein by, not by Sein, but by givenness. So, for Marion, with givenness, we're outside of being in the phenomenological reduction to givenness, because something else might be giving itself besides being. For example, we already have this with Levinas. The call of the other is not a question of being, but a question of responsibility. It's ethical in character. Heidegger's philosophy lacks ethics, other than a self-absorbed ethics of the self and its own most authentic possibilities, being toward death. Levinas in all soberness, looking at human history, looking at the Shoah of the Jewish people in World War II, in Nazi Germany, 6 million Jewish men, women, and children murdered systematically. How did this happen? Levinas says in philosophy, and again, he's formulating a lot of this philosophy as a prisoner of war from 1940 to 1945. His life was spared as a Jewish man because he was serving in the French military as a translator. But Levinas writes existence and existence as a prisoner of war. He starts developing these things. What went missing in philosophy was ethics. So the call of the other is an example of something outside of being. For Levinas, the call of the other is not a kind of givenness. He goes so far as to call it a non-phenomenon. So that's more radical, I would say, even than Marion, even though Marion writes after Levinas and borrows much from Levinas. But with Levinas, we have touching through phenomenology on a non-phenomenon that doesn't give itself, but says itself, signifies itself. So in this book, I talk about how with the radicality of the phenomenological reduction, we have two forms of the radicality. One in Marion to givenness, the other in Levinas to the call of the other, the ethical exigency of the respondent and responsibility for the other. And when we combine all of this, we have a more full picture of phenomenality. So, but to stick with Marion, can I say more about the question of what is outside of being given to us by a saturated phenomenon in itself, in the phenomenon itself? What is outside of being? Well, first of all, I'm thinking first of all, something like an emotional experience. Let's take an example of fear. Fear. The experience of fear is not straight away a question of being. It's being provoked by the fear of not being. So what am I afraid of? Not being, but its lack as a possibility. So there's the givenness of the possibility of me not being me, of me no longer being, not being myself. There's a possibility of this loss of the capacity, the ability to persist in my being, to persist in my existence, to persist in my selfhood, in my Dasein. So if I'm afraid of something, it's this Heideggerian Dasein, the possibility of it no longer being there. And this is, I'm afraid. But there's a givenness of that possibility that is not a function of Sein or Dasein itself. There's an alterity of the possibility of non-being that is I'm not familiar with, and so I might be afraid of. This could be like an example. Again, in my description, I'm referencing Heidegger, but I'm also trying to point to something outside of Heidegger, outside of Sein, even through the analogia entis in the mode of phenomenology, through the analogy of being with reference to Heidegger, but trying to go beyond Heidegger. So, yes, we can think about this in terms of givenness outside of being. Levinas, I say, is more radical. signification outside of givenness, the call of the other, ethical exigency. So this would be some examples. For Marion, his formula then in this phenomenology of givenness is so much reduction, so much givenness. The more we bracket the natural attitude, the more we bracket the unwarranted limits of possibility, even in Heidegger with the domination of Sein and Dasein, even in Husserl with the domination of the obsession for objectivity. In Marion, we have a bracketing of the brackets, and Husserl and Heidegger moving us to a greater field of both perception and givenness. Marion wonders about the sort of phenomenon that could give itself here. This inversion of the ego of Dasein in Marion, through Levinas, is positing the call. So Marion talks about the call of givenness. And I feel like I shouldn't make any judgments here, but Marion is bootlegging the concept of call in Levinas and applying it to givenness. Levinas would not go for that, I can tell you. Levinas says when he uses the language of call of the other, this is not modality of givenness. It's something else. So for Marion to transpose Levinas's concept of the call of givenness, Marion is simply trying to show this is how radical givenness is in his reduction, but he loses the uniqueness of the ethical, the irreducibility of the ethical that we have in Levinas by reducing it to givenness. So that's for another time to talk more about that. But Marion, in his book Reduction and Givenness, says that in the pure form of the call, a reduction is carried out. Nothing manages to give itself as a phenomenon if the response does not give itself over to it as to an originary claim. So that's how Marion is talking about the call of the phenomenon, not the ethical call of the other, but the call of any and all phenomena, including ethical ones. He tries to subsume all of this under the heading of givenness. So the affirmative response to the call of givenness in the form of abandonment by the human subject, the surrender of the subject's subjectivity in Marion, is the result of the reduction deployed to its fullest potential. The ego is converted into the Interloke, der Angesprochene, the called, the gifted, Marion says. So this is an original concept of Marion. And in some ways, it has the fingerprints of Heidegger on it, because when he does talk about subjectivity, he's talking about, the one who receives this deluge of givenness as interloque, the one who is called, again, not exclusively by the ethical call of the other we have in Levinas, but the one who is called by all the givenness and experience. Again, so much phenomenological reduction, so much receptivity of givenness. So the further the reduction is exerted, and again, for phenomenology, what's being reduced is not thought, is not the thing itself, but a reductionistic approach to the thing itself. Reductionism is being reduced in phenomenology, and so you have the broadening, the widening, the bracketing of the brackets, we could say, of the natural attitude, and setting those brackets aside. So with the saturated phenomenon, there's more phenomenality given to view. Vision is in fact saturated and bedazzled, blinded by the luminous flood of givenness. A continuity of recognition can be traced from Plato's cave, the allegory of the cave, for example, to Marion's donative and erotic reduction. It is because of Marion's critique of the reductions of Husserl and Heidegger. In some ways, as I said, a return to Husserl through a critique of Heidegger that Marion is able to propose this third reduction he considers even more radical than those of Husserl and Heidegger, the reduction to givenness. And at the same time, the reduction to love. Love as phenomenon and all the phenomena associated with love saturate. And if we're true to human experience, are not the majority of our songs about love? Are not the majority of our concerns, are these not about love? As we face the day, as we go on our way, do we not cry out in this silent yet so real call of the heart? Does anyone out there love me? Does anyone love me? And if we don't find an affirmative response to that question, we're very sad and lonely and depressed. And so we have all these kind of feelings that accompany us when we find an affirmative response to the question, does anyone out there love me? Go missing. So Marion is bringing that question back in. More important, admissibly, for us in philosophy than Descartes' question, can I be certain about this or that? This systematic process of doubt, progression of, well, I could doubt this sense perception, I could doubt this or that understanding I currently have. It could be revised. Perhaps this current understanding in theory is only partial and provisional, which is the way of science and every kind of science. So how can I be certain about something? And Descartes is left with cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But what if Marion says, so what? In his book, The Erotic Phenomenon. So what, Descartes? You think, therefore you are? But are you lonely? Are you miserable? What's the point? What's so great about your epistemological certainty? And Marion says we can have all the epistemological certainty in the world, but we still cry out a deeper philosophical question. Does anyone out there love me? And so we're brought into this erotic reduction, the reduction to love, and Marion gives us a tremendous phenomenology of love in his book, The Erotic Phenomenon, and many other works. So, in supplying the necessary warrants for this third reduction to givenness, Marion, in effect, opens the possibility of using phenomenology to explore religious phenomena. That is, phenomena that give themselves in religious contexts to saturating degree. This is a common denominator, we could say, of religious experience, religious phenomena, where human subjectivity is saturated, is shaken up, is called into question, is met with compunction, examination of conscience, the possibilities of conversion of the self, that the self might undergo change, that the self may be reformed, reimagined, be born again. A renaissance of the self is what happens within the field of religious experience. A purification of the self, a catharsis of the self. Without religious experience, the self continues to claim its own self-sufficiency. It has no need of change. It's fine as it is, especially in cultures in which we live in today, where we have grocery stores and conveniences. We're fine. We go on eating and drinking and taking care of business, and the self isn't called into question necessarily. It's at the helm of every experience, and we live in this very instinctive at best pragmatic way, lifestyle. But with this phenomenology of givenness, uh, then brought into religious context, we're going to explore the possibilities of the self's giving itself up to the point of abandonment, which is another way of describing love. Self giving to the other to the point of abandonment. Receptivity to the other as gift. Receptivity to life as gift. Understanding and approaching, because we're being approached by the possibilities of salvation and everything meant by salvation. Being saved from death, being saved from sin, being saved from ignorance, being saved from doubt, being saved from skepticism, cynicism, nihilism, fundamentalism, relativism, being saved from all these things by a type of saturated phenomenon that brings the goods, we could say, that delivers the truth, that delivers the self from itself. And why called religious, why described as religious? Because from the Latin religare, to be bound to something as ultimate concern, as ultimate meaning in life, that gave itself first. And so I receive it, and I am nursed by it. What about this possibility, this paradoxical possibility that I don't give birth to the phenomenon but it gives birth to me, and I don't nurse it, but it nurses me? This is the stuff of religious experience that we cling to, that we live for, that we may even be willing to die for, because we're dealing with the absolute. The absolute in terms of what gives itself. So this, one can assess the plausibility structures, the coherence, the logic, the patterns of religious phenomena, religious experience, such as theophanies, prayer, worship, exegesis of sacred text, oracles, prophecy, law, responsibilities, communal life, and in some, the possibility of divine revelation and possible human responses to it. So phenomenology is a perfect philosophical method to investigate any religious experience in any religious tradition, any point of view, any proposals of divine revelation and divinity. Phenomenology comes as this field, as Husserl said, of neutral researches to investigate. Let's gather up the evidence of givenness for Marion, the evidence of givenness for Levinas, the evidence of signification, the evidence of morality, the evidence of ethics. What kind of conversion is taking place in a given individual or community? How can we receive those meanings and significations and describe them? And then in the end, make a response to them. In this book, I argue, in the end, to get back to the threshing floor of judgment, separating the true from the false, phenomenology can't do this. It's a limitation of the method. Phenomenology can bring about clarity, gather up evidence of givenness or signification and meaning within lived experience, but phenomenology forfeits the act of judgment. This is a metaphysical act. It's cashing in all one's chips. It's laying down all one's cards. It's making a final witness, testimony to what one believes to be the case, to what one believes to be true. And this, we have to go back to classical metaphysics, which is the anchor that grants the sure footing for the judgment. Phenomenology, we are very versatile. We are floating in midair. We are gathering up all this evidence. We're very nimble and agile, but we were unable to make a judgment with phenomenology because the method would betray itself in doing so. And to make a claim, a judgment, ultimately is a return back to the Seinsfrage in the classical sense, not the modern sense, but the Seinsfrage in terms of what is and what is not just what gives. What is not. And we don't have this in Marion, we don't have this in any phenomenologist because it's not phenomenology. But we do have this in the classical metaphysicians. What is not. So phenomenology gives us greater evidence for metaphysics to make judgments about. This is its benefit for metaphysics. So thank you, Imran, for this question. There's possibilities of abandoning the self to saturation and ethically subsuming the self to the other as ways of access to truth are fascinating expansions of the worlding of Dasein. Yes, I totally agree. That's why I get so excited to think about the philosophy of Marion, because he contradicts the Heideggerian prohibition of design as this kind of hermeneutical absolute, and not dispensing with that primary point of reference of Dasein. And Heidegger is doing this by warding off any concept of theology. No theologumena, no talk about God or divine revelation in Heideggerian's methodological atheism. But is that fair for phenomenology to have methodological atheism? Marion is saying, no, that's not warranted by the method. That's putting limits on a method that is opposed to limits. Phenomenology, what it first investigates is what are the superficial, artificial, unwarranted limits we are imposing on phenomena. We need to delimit the limits. And when we delimit limitation, we expand perception to all this givenness. So Dasein is overturned. The fear of contaminating Dasein's neutrality causes an obstruction of possibility, Marion would say, for that which gives itself to the self. Marion argues that Dasein and the question of being are not ultimate. That which gives itself, the phenomenon itself, is ultimate. However, at the same time, Marion does not claim to be converting phenomenology to a pure theology by introducing the possibility of the saturated phenomenon with its ensuing configurations and paradigmatic content. Rather, he insists, quoting from his book Being Given, English translation, page 234, that with the question of a phenomenon taking saturation to its maximum, it is not straightaway or always a question of debating the status of the theological in phenomenology, but at the outset and in the first place, we're talking about the possibility of the figure of phenomenality as such, end quote. So this should allay any concerns that phenomenology has smuggled in theology defiantly against the method through the back door. But rather, phenomenology itself is the back door of asking questions about truth, clarity about data and evidence. And theological experience and meanings, religious experience, is also fair game for this method of phenomenology. And we have this on display in the work of Paul Ricoeur, Emmanuel Levinas, Jean-Luc Marion, Emmanuel Falk, Edith Stein, even earlier than all of these, in a more apophatic way, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Eric Chavara, Hans-Urs von Balthasar in some way, Karl Rahner in some way. So we start to get these figures where we might ask, is he or she a philosopher or a theologian? And we have a both ands possible here at this stage, at this juncture in the history of phenomenology. And it's entirely possible to investigate religious experience according to the setup by Marion through the concept of the saturated phenomenon that gives itself, phenomena that give themselves to the highest degrees within lived experience. So thank you for joining me on this live stream, Jean-Luc Marion, and the radicality of his phenomenology of givenness. May you continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you on the next one.